With me again today is Dr. Christian Körner from the University of Bern in Switzerland, who so graciously accepted yet another invitation to talk about Cypriot foundation myths and mythology. Christian, again, thank you so much for accepting my invitation.
Thank you for your invitation, Andreas. I'm happy to be here again. Great. Thank you very much.
Awesome. So we're going to talk about foundation myths. We're going to talk a little bit about mythology. And, I think a lot of what we're going to talk about comes out of the context of the Iron Age period and the city kingdoms. And just to provide some background and context, can you just give us some overview of what the period was like?
Of course. Cyprus is a fascinating special case when you compare it to Greek mainland. In Cyprus, there were living Greeks in antiquity, but they had different traditions than their cousins in the mainland. First and most remarkable, they did prefer a local syllabary script over the Greek alphabet. And the syllabary had its roots probably in the Bronze Age. And when Greeks began to settle on the island, they did not yet have their own alphabet. Therefore, they adapted the Cypriot syllabary to the language. And after the invention of the alphabet, Cypriot Greeks continued to write primarily in the syllabary until the 4th century BC. Another interesting feature, while in the mainland, monarchy was rather the exception. All Cypriot states were reigned by basileis, kings, probably also a tradition going back to the late Bronze Age. So you see, Greek Cypriots seem to have been more conservative, or at least very traditional. And then the Greeks were not the only group living on the island. There were also Phoenicians who came from the Levant, today Lebanon, and settled especially in Kition, but their traces can be found all over the island. And finally, there probably was a third group, which scholars call Cypriots, real Cypriots, since some of the syllabary inscriptions are definitely not Greek, but were written in an unknown language. This must be another linguistic group, maybe descendants of the original Bronze Age population of the island. So Cyprus was a melting pot, or maybe not a melting pot, but a place where different cultures, different languages lived together. And it was not united in one state. It was always separated in several kingdoms. Their number fluctuated around 10. And these kingdoms were competing against each other. And one of the main points of the conflicts was access to resources, especially the precious copper mines in the Troodos Mountains. All these kingdoms were ruled by kings, dynasties, some of them Greek, other Phoenician, but the population seems to have been mixed. So in Amathus in the south, where most inscriptions of the Cypriots were found, the kings bore Greek names. So they probably were Greek, while part of the population was not Greek. The most important kingdoms, which I think we will talk about later when we come to the myths, are Salamis on the east coast, Kition, which was ruled by Phoenicians in the 5th and 4th centuries BC, which is in the south. It's modern Larnaca, where all the planes from outside are landing, and then Amathus in the south and Soli in the northwest, and of course Paphos with the famous sanctuary of Aphrodite in the western part of the island.
You call foundation myths, and this is a quote from one of your papers, intentional history, that they have to be understood and explained in the context of the time in which they were recorded and disseminated. So can you tell me what you meant by that?
Older scholarship thought that myth reflected the long-distant past, and that, for example, in the Homeric epics, they reflected the Mycenaean Bronze Age. And since the first written literary texts are from the 8th century BC, Homer and the Bronze Age culture in Greece had vanished about the 12th century, so there would be a gap of about 400 years. According to older scholarship, this gap would have been bridged by oral tradition until Homer finally wrote down this oral tradition. And already in the 20th century, studies have proven that you cannot bridge such a long gap with oral traditions. So therefore, historical science has stressed that you have to interpret myths against the background of the times when they were told, when they were written down. For example, if you talk about Homer, Homer's epics reflect the values, the ideas of the time in which they were written, in which Homer, or whoever that man was, lived. Although they transpose the action of their stories in a distant past, you still have not a historical record of what has happened in the late Bronze Age. So you have to focus on the time when the myths were told, when they were written down, in order to see what people were associating with these myths, what they were thinking, what these myths meant. And it's rather difficult to use them as sources for an earlier time, the Bronze Age.
And these foundation myths, they survive in texts that were written much later. So maybe you can tell us a little bit about those sources that mention these Cypriot foundation myths, when they were generally written and for what purpose?
Yes, of course. I think it's the same problem we have already discussed in earlier discussions. We are still facing the general problem of reconstructing Cypriot history. There are not many surviving texts, so we have to gather everything we can. I've tried to collect all the evidence where foundation myths for Cypriot cities have survived, and I will mention only two examples from very different periods, Stephanos of Byzantium and Lycophron of Alexandria. To start at the end, one of the most important and interesting texts comes from the early Byzantine period. Stephanos of Byzantium was a teacher at the library of Constantinople in the 6th century AD. And he wrote an enormous lexicon containing more than 3,000 articles on cities, places, and names. In the library of Constantinople, there must have been a large number of texts he could use. And among these 3,000 articles, there are 19 concerning Cypriot cities. Sometimes Stephanos does mention a foundation myth, but unfortunately his lexicon has only survived in a very abbreviated form. Obviously, people were tired of copying the whole enormous lexicon and arranged the best of, and we only have the best of. Therefore, our information often is scarce. But sometimes Stephanos gives us his sources where he has gathered his information. And I hope to show in another article that most of his sources come from Hellenistic times, from the 3rd to 1st century BC. So, but you see, one of the major sources is more than 1,000 years later than the vanishing of the independent Cypriot city kingdoms. The second text I think is very interesting is from the Hellenistic period, which is about 3rd to 1st century before Christ. You see, we are now much closer to archaic and classical city kingdoms. And in this Hellenistic period, Greek scholars were collecting information concerning various issues, especially origins of names, cities. They were editing text. For example, they made an edition of Homer's epics. And one of the centers of this Greek scholarship was Alexandria in Egypt, with its famous library and university. And in Hellenistic times, there was also a strange fascination for writing highly elaborate poetic works, sometimes very hard to understand even at the time, obviously aiming at a very sophisticated readership. And these texts, of course, are difficult to interpret from modern research. And one of these texts, which I really like, is from a man named Lycophron. It is a strange monologue of Alexandra. That's another name for the famous Cassandra, the priestess of Troy, who predicted the fall of Troy, but nobody would believe her. And in this monologue by Lycophron, she prophesies what will happen after the fall of Troy. And in her prophecies, she also mentions 5 heroes who will come to Cyprus and settle there. So obviously, there must have been foundation myth, which Lycophron used in this enigmatic text. So if you're asking about the purpose of these texts, I think Lycophron, for example, wrote for these highly educated readers who could decipher his allusions, which already at the time must have been sometimes obscure. And other Hellenistic authors rather had a scientific approach, trying to collect knowledge, explain names, explain origins. And with the Hellenistic period also started this tradition of writing lexica, which continued in the Roman imperial period. And in this tradition are, of course, also the later great lexica of the Byzantine period, such as Stephanos Byzantium, who were collecting all available information on certain topics, such as names, origins of places, or natural phenomena. So you see, the main purpose of many of these texts was not to tell us a myth, but to show something else.
You just mentioned that the Trojan War, and many of these myths, they're linked to the Trojan War and the Nostoi, which I'm sure you'll kind of elaborate on. What were they, and are these examples of the intentional history that you mentioned earlier?
Yes, I think so. Nostos means in English return. We still have the word nostalgic, which comes from nostos, which you long to get home. And nostoi are the myths told about the return of the Greek heroes after the fall of Troy. The most famous nostos, of course, is Odysseus, who has a long journey home until he arrives at Ithaca. And when they come home, they sometimes face big problems, such as Agamemnon, who was slaughtered by his wife and her lover. So these nostoi are a genre of itself, of myth told how to return. Some of these heroes did not return home, but were able to start a new life elsewhere. And that's where the myths concerning Cyprus come in, because some of these heroes land in Cyprus. I think we will talk about that a little bit later. The Trojan War is, of course, the most influential and most important myth of Greek antiquity. Therefore, it was wonderful if you were able to trace back your origins to this myth. Even the Romans had the luck that their foundation could be connected to the Trojan War. The Trojan survivor Aeneas has to find a new home for the Trojans who have survived the destruction of the city, and after several adventures, he manages to arrive in the region of the later Rome and founds a city here, not yet Rome, but Lavinium. And according to the myth, one of his later descendants is Romulus, who 500 years later is said to have founded Rome. So the Romans could claim to be of Trojan descent and thereby also insert themselves into this great Greek myth, who was known in the whole Mediterranean area.
Are there any Cypriot ones that you could share with listeners right now? Because so many, like you said, they're linked directly to the Trojan War, and I guess there's several that I think come to mind.
Yes, one of the most interesting cases in point is probably Teucer. He's the brother of Ajax. Both are Greek heroes fighting in the Trojan War. And then Ajax has a dispute with Odysseus, who shall receive the weapons of the dead hero Achilles. And Odysseus, as usual, is able to trick Ajax. And then Ajax literally goes mad, and or is driven mad by the goddess Athena, who is supporting Odysseus. Ajax then kills a herd of sheep, thinking they are his Greek enemies. And when he recovers from his madness, he realizes what he has done and is so ashamed that he commits suicide. So Teucer returns home alone without his brother Ajax to Salamis. And there his father reproaches him for not having revenged his brother, or at least trying to save him. So Teucer is dispelled and with his companions sails to Cyprus, where he founds a city and names it Salamis after his home country. So you see this myth, which was already told in the 5th century by the Athenian tragedists, serves several purposes. It explains why the two cities, Salamis, the island of Salamis and Salamis in Cyprus, bear the same name. And of course, it connects Salamis with the Trojan War. The ruling dynasty of Salamis, whose most famous member was Evagrius, I think we have spoken about him a lot, traced their ancestry back to the Teucrids, to Teucer.
And there's a lot of place names across Cyprus that, if you're not familiar with it, you'd be surprised now to hear that. I think of Acamas in Northwest Cyprus. A lot of us, it's like, oh, that's a place, that's Northwest Cyprus. It's just a name, but that too is linked, if I'm not mistaken, to the Nostoi.
Yes. Acamas is the son of Theseus and is said to have landed on the northwestern peninsula, which is still called today Acamas, and then to have founded the city of Soli, or a city which would later become Soli in the northwest of Cyprus. Yes, there are several of these heroes. Praxandros, who is said to have founded Lapetos, which also on the northern coast. So there are a lot of Greek cities who try to connect with the Trojan War, or we should rather say their kings, their dynasties, maybe try to establish this connection.
Yeah. So, and here's the thing: you mentioned this. You say Were they Athenian narratives legitimizing Attic influence on Cyprus, or were they promoted by ruling Cypriot dynasties? What's your interpretation? Is it one or the other, or is it a little bit of both?
I think it was the famous Swedish archaeologist Einar Gerstad who strongly thought that the Athenians tried to legitimize their influence by telling these myths. I'm rather skeptical, as are other scholars. Of course, you could make politics by referring to myths. For example, in Athens, the introduction of democracy was also legitimized by claiming that even the mythical king Theseus had already established democratic forms of government. But I do not see any myth for Cyprus which Athens could have used to legitimize influence on Cyprus. I'm rather think that it was the ruling dynasties who, in the late 5th and especially in 4th century, when Athens really had this reputation, tried to find Athenian connections. Perhaps the Trojan connection was more important. But I think another story is much more interesting concerning Soli. It's not a myth in the strict sense of the term, but it's rather, I call it a legend. This is the special case where the foundation is also explained by historical figure, by the Athenian statesman and philosopher Solon. It's interesting because all the other myths are taking place in a distant past of 12th century or something like that. And Solon really was a historical person living in the 6th century BC. And according to the story, Solon was a guest of Philokybros, the king of Soli. And the city then bore the name Aipeia and was located on a hill. And Soli suggested that the king transferred his city to the plain at the sea. Aipeia was located on a hill, and as I said, Solon suggested that the king transferred his city to the plain. And to thank Solon, the king later named the new city after the philosopher. So how to explain this story? First, it gives an explanation of the origin of the city's name. But then it has also the advantage that the ruling dynasty of Soli could refer to one of the most famous Greek statesmen. And there may also be another point. Plutarch, who tells us the story, cites an epigram by Solon written for the king of Soli. And if this epigram is authentic, there obviously was a contact between Solon and the city of Soli. And the story then further embellished this by claiming that the city had taken its name from Solon. By the way, Solon cannot have been the namesake for Soli, since the name Soli is already attested way before his lifetime in the Syrian inscriptions from the early 7th century. But for the dynasty of Soli, it may have been a welcome promotion, a way of promoting themselves to say that they had connection to one of the most famous statesmen and philosophers of the 6th century BC.
That's really interesting. Do we have any evidence of an increased Athenian Solian relationship? Does the archaeology attest anything in particular?
Not really. Sometimes there's the question whether Attic imports in the northwestern part of Cyprus, especially Marion, but also a little bit at Soli, may point to a political connection. But I would be rather skeptical if you could use these imports to deduce that there was also a political alliance or something like that. But obviously, the dynasty of Soli thought it would be good for them to say that they had this personal contact with Solon. And if the epigram is authentic, I think Solon may really have been in Soli. After his work in Athens, he is said to have traveled far from Athens, so why not to Soli in Cyprus?
Now, not all stories or cities like Amathus or Paphos are associated with these, Athenian foundation myths. Some are linked to autochthonous founders. Can you share with listeners some of these interesting foundation myths?
One of the most important figure of the autochthonous tradition, as I would like to call it, is probably Kinyras, a Cypriot king of Greek mythology, often referred to in Greek mythology. And there are really a lot of stories told about him, which are not all compatible to each other. First, I think he appears already in Homer. He donated a breastplate to Agamemnon for the Trojan War, but personally did not take part, was not part of this Trojan War. And according to later writers, there was a funny story. He was invited to join the Greeks, or at least deliver ships, and he promised to send 50 ships, but then sent only one ship and 49 little ship models made of clay, so that he could fulfill his promise without too much costs for himself. In later Greek-Roman tradition, he becomes the father of Myrrha, who has a very pervert crush on her own father and tricks him into sleeping with her. And then afterwards, she is turned into the plant Myrrha, which still bears her name. And their mutual son is Adonis, later lover of Aphrodite. Aphrodite, which of course is the most important goddess of Cyprus. Another of these figures, of these indigenous figures, I would like to call them, is the important figure of Pygmalion, who has survived in European literature until even to the musical My Fair Lady. Pygmalion was in one tradition a Cypriot king. In the most famous version by the Roman poet Ovidius, he becomes an artist in Cyprus who fell in love with the statue he has modeled. And thanks to the goddess of love, Aphrodite, the statue becomes alive. As you can see, these figures are associated with numerous different stories which changed over the centuries, and it is therefore very difficult to assess the importance they had for the Cypriots of archaic and classical times. But at least Kinyras was such an important indigenous figure that most probably some dynasties refer to him as their ancestor. At least there is a very interesting inscription, I think it was found in Nicosia, of referring to or calling Nicocles, the last king of Paphos, a descendant of Kinyras. So it seems that dynasties refer to Kinyras. There's also, I think it's already mentioned by Isocrates, an Athenian orator of the 4th century, that the Teucrids, the dynasty of Salamis with Evagoras, also referred to Kinyras as another ancestor of the dynasty. So he obviously was important for the dynasties which ruled until the late 4th century BC.
Wow. Something else that really piqued my interest was to learn that there's actually a couple of Phoenician foundation myths in Cyprus as well. And this for me was truly new learning. I actually never heard these foundation myths before. I was hoping maybe you can share which foundation myths are associated with Cyprus, which cities in particular, and when and where were they first attested?
I do not think that we can really speak about Phoenician myth since we do not have real stories here, but just names associated with Cypriot places such as Kition, Slapetos, two cities where definitely Phoenicians ruled. Perhaps also Carpattia, where one is not sure if it really was a kingdom of its own, but it's also associated with a Phoenician name. For example, when Teucer comes to Cyprus, Teucer the Trojan hero, he is supported by Belos of Tyrus, who is said to have owned a part of Cyprus and donates it to Teucer to found the city Salamis. Belos appears several times. He was the father of the famous Queen Dido, who founded Carthage in the Western Mediterranean. But I do not think that we have here reflections of Phoenician mythological traditions, but I think it's rather Greek speculations to explain the Phoenician presence on the island by way of telling myths. I think you have to see myth is something like a pre-scientific approach to explain certain phenomena, or for example names, or even populations. And so these stories explain for Greek readers why there are Phoenicians on the island, because Belos of Tyrus donated a part of this land, or because he founded cities. So that was a way of explaining things.
Okay, I see. Speaking of places that have connections to myths, names, you hinted at it, and I just want to say it one more time. What is it that they set out to do, this pre-scientific thing that you just mentioned? And if you can give some examples of that, what comes to mind is like the connection with Idalian, for example, or Agapenor. What is it that they're doing when they're making these connections?
The case of Idalion is a nice little story. It's just 2.5 lines in Stephanos of Byzantium's lexicon, but it's really nice. According to Stephanos, a king named Chalcanor received an oracle to build a city where the sun would rise. And when he walked through the land with his companions, one of his companions called out, "Looking the sun," in Greek, "Ide basiloiton alion." And if you abbreviate Ide basiloiton alion to Idealion, you almost have Idalion. So that's obviously a pun on the name Idalion. So the name of the city is explained by this exclamation by a mythical figure. And the name of the king is also telling. Chalcanor means literally copper man, Chalkos being copper, Aner being man. And Idalion was very famous for its important copper deposits. I just finished an article on this myth and hope to show that Stephanos had found the story in one of these Alexandrian texts of Hellenistic times, which were destined to entertain a sophisticated audience who was able to decipher these puns and allusions. Cyprus at that time was part of the Ptolemaic Egyptian Empire, and therefore an audience in Alexandria maybe knew that Cyprus had a lot of copper, so perhaps they were laughing when they heard the name Chalcanor, Copperman. Yeah, could be. Agapenor, again, you also mentioned him, was a Greek hero from Arcadia who is said to be have been the founder of Paphos. And there is an obvious similarity between the Greek dialect in Cyprus and the Arcadian Greek dialect. So the story perhaps served to explain the similarity by an early immigration of Arcadians in Cyprus. So that would also come back to this pre-scientific approach of explaining things.
These stories are so interesting just to know, the Idalian one. I think that one's really cool. I mean, whether or not that's actually true,
Yeah.
That's another question altogether, but they are really fascinating stories. I really enjoy hearing them. One that I've always found interesting is the myth of couple of myths around Perseus and even Theseus supposedly making his way to Cyprus from Crete, which doesn't make any sense geographically. I mean, he's supposed to be going back to Athens, but he leaves a mark of a peculiar custom, I think specifically in Amathus, which I think listeners will get a kick out of this. Can you talk about it?
Yeah, Theseus, I think many listeners will know him, is the famous Athenian hero who sails to Crete to defeat the monster Minotaurus living in this labyrinth. And when he comes to Crete, the daughter of the king of Crete, of King Minos, which is Ariadne, gives him a thread so that he can find his way back in the labyrinth once he has killed the Minotaur. And Theseus goes into the labyrinth, kills the Minotaurus, and then finds his way back thanks to Ariadne's thread. And then he sails back to Athens. In the most common version, he has a dream that Ariadne is already promised to the god Dionysus, and that he is not allowed to marry her. So he leaves her behind, sleeping on the island of Naxos, and sails home to Athens. That's the most common version of the story. But there obviously was another version where he manages to get to Cyprus, which is quite a long way, and lands there together with Ariadne and the region of later Amathus. And there Ariadne dies giving birth. And then Theseus establishes a strange ritual where young men simulate giving birth, and also establishes cult for Ariadne together with Aphrodite, the most important goddess of Cyprus. Obviously, there must have been a very peculiar rite at Amathus, whose origins later Greeks perhaps did not understand anymore. And this story may have provided some kind of information or explanation. In this case, we know that the story must have come from Cyprus itself. That's interesting, since Plutarch, to whom we owe the story, refers to a writer named Paeon, who himself came from Amathus, probably living in the 3rd century BC. So this must be a local tradition, connecting this strange ritual with arrival of Theseus and Ariadne. The other person you mentioned, Perseus, is also interestingly, we know from Cyprus itself that it was something they must have spoken about there. Perseus is worshipped at Kurion. There are several inscriptions from Kurion, also a little city kingdom on the southern coast. And these inscriptions refer to Perseus and to Perseus and call Kurion even city of Perseus. Obviously, people of Kurion traced the origins of the city back to Perseus from Argos. And Herodotus, already in the 5th century, calls Kurion, or the Kurians, descendants from Argives. So I think with these two heroes, we may have a glimpse to local traditions which have been told and which were then taken up by Greek writers from outside of Cyprus.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. You call this advertising campaigns, I think, at one point.
Mm-hmm.
I guess my kind of last question here is, as an advertising campaign, do we have any sense of how well they were known at the time? Are these stories really only known by the elite, or do you think common folk have been quite familiar with them?
That is really difficult to assess who knew these stories. I think we can at least say one thing if we take again this strange text by Lycophron. I think there may be an indication. The naturalness with which Lycophron can allude to these myths in his enigmatic texts is striking. So I think obviously the audience for which he wrote must have been familiar with these stories. Of course, this audience must have been a wealthy elite, perhaps in Alexandria. So we do not know how the stories were reflected in Cyprus. But I think also the lexicon of Stephanos has a certain way of telling these stories as if Stephanos thinks that many readers are already familiar with them. You don't have to explain everything. So at least in literary, how should I call it, a sophisticated audience in Greek and Roman times must have been familiar with these stories and interested in learning perhaps certain nuances, certain little aspects they did not know. If you go to Cyprus, I think we can at least say that the dynasties who tried to enhance their
prestige.
splendor, prestige, exactly, by referring to Athens or to the Trojan War, they must have gotten something out of that. So obviously they were trying to tell stories, to invent ancestors, because they thought that this would impress other people. And I think that's really interesting case in point is the Teucer dynasty in Salamis, which claimed descent from the Greek Teucrus, thereby Trojan War, but also claimed the connection to the indigenous Kinyras. And if you also take the story that Belos of Tyros was donating part of his land to Teucrus, you would also have even a Phoenician connection. So I think that's something with which the dynasty may have tried to show that they are really of old descent, going back to the Trojan War, and that they have also a really deep connection to the land in which they are living. And maybe they could also say, yes, and we have Phoenicians in Salamis because Belos of Tyros also once was here. And the same thing is, I think, can be said about Paphos. If Nicocles of Paphos, the last king, is called descendant of Kinyras, this obviously was a way of impressing people who could read this inscription. And then you look at the contemporary orator Isocrates of Athens. He was definitely familiar with the royal house at Salamis. And he also mentions this connection to Teucrus. So I think Isocrates would not have mentioned that if it was not something that the kings of Salamis would like to have the Greek audience to know. But to come back to your question, it is difficult to say how the normal people in quotation marks responded to these myths.